Lakes and rivers. Besides dangerous sea animals, what else is beneath those dark waters? Grab a blanket, turn off your lights, and get your life jacket, 'cause we may be jumping into it to find out. Lady of the Lake. My maternal grandfather grew up in a remote area of Nova Scotia, Canada, in the 1930s. His mother passed away of a severe ear infection when he was quite young. In the area they lived in, there were no real doctors to prescribe antibiotics, which possibly could have saved her life. My grandfather's father remarried a woman whom I met as a teenager when she was in her late 90s. The story I'm about to relay has been in my family since I can remember. As a little boy of about 6 or 7, my grandfather didn't really have much supervision. As they weren't the wealthiest of folks, my grandfather's father spent many hours away from the house as a ferry captain. I no longer remember the name of the boat, but I believe it is actually pictured on the Canadian dime. My grandfather and his buddies one day decided to take a rowboat out onto the nearby lake. They rowed to the middle of the lake and were messing around like little kids do, when suddenly they dropped an oar into the lake. They paddled their hands to reach it. My grandfather reached for the oar, and the boat started to tip. Much to their surprise, a female hand rose out of the water and handed my grandfather back the oar. All the little boys sat quietly for a few minutes, in shock. They scanned the water surface to see if someone had possibly gone for a swim. There was no one in the water coming up for air. There were no other boats at the lake either. They rowed back to shore as quickly as they could, and each ran home. My grandfather relayed the story to his stepmother, who stared at him warily. In later years, she confessed that she believed him to be telling the truth. Not long after, my grandfather and his friends were back at the lake. They were standing on a bridge, looking into the water when they could see stones being thrown into the water. The stones were coming from above them and seemed to appear as if they were falling from the sky. My grandfather looked down into the water, and there, just below the surface, was the image of a woman looking up at him. I don't have any more details of what this woman looked like. It has long been believed in my family that the woman that handed him the oar and the woman under the water were his mother looking out for him from the other side. On the same trip where I met my great stepmother as a teenager, I was taken to the area where my grandfather grew up. It was a remote, wild, and beautiful area. I saw the lake where all of this occurred. My grandfather passed away from cancer in the early 1970s. I was only 4 years old. I do not have much by way of personal memories of him, but this story of him as a brave little boy who had lost his mom will stay with me for the rest of my life. Thanks for reading. The Swamp Lady. Okay, here is my first story to tell. I do not consider myself a very good storyteller, so apologies up front. I might ramble. This one happened to my older son several years ago, based on my very limited knowledge of local history and that he never said these sorts of things before, and the level of fear he had, well, I honestly believed him. So, we live in the countryside. Horses, sheep, tractors, tiny village population, where the most outrageous crimes that occurs is the occasional motor yanked off a boat. Also, we live on an island. My son would walk to school every day, which wasn't far, perhaps a mile or two. Along the way, there was a small swampy area, half an acre if that, usually populated with ducks and horses. I have come to this place many times before on my own, as it had that feel to it, an off sort of feeling, like you're always being watched. I have been chased out a couple times by angry bees and even a hawk once. Now I approach respectfully and all is well. For about a week several years back, my son would get home pretty agitated, until he eventually said he didn't want to walk to school anymore. I asked why, and he tells me that whenever he walks past the swamp, some weird lady talks to him. Of course, my mommy hackles rise and I ask what lady, did he know her, what did she say, etc. It is not unusual out here for people to be friendly, and my son is a pretty friendly kid who hardly ever has an issue chatting up perfect strangers, but to see him so upset was really worrying. He says he has never seen her, so he doesn't know what she looks like. So that is weird. Now I am quiet and just let him talk. He tells me she knows his name, and she says it when he walks by. At first it was only his name. Later she would ask him to come into the trees, but that was it. Sometimes he would hear whispers, but couldn't really hear what was being said. Of course, I give him rides to school till he feels better, and I tell him to stay out of the area, not because of the lady, but because when it gets wet it can get quite dangerous, so best to just stay out. So I tell my husband while we are having coffee with his dad. They both grew up out here. Old family farmer, and his swamp area used to be owned by my husband's grandfather. His dad got pretty quiet, and even a bit concerned. He tells us that about 50 some odd years ago, there was a small family who lived up the road, a husband, a wife, and one small son. The husband was a total asshole. He beat his wife and treated her like a house slave. When their son got a little older and started going to school, the wife killed herself. In the swampy area, the woman laid face down in some water and drowned herself. They found her several days later. Eventually the husband died, but the son still lives around here and rides his three-wheeler bike back and forth to grocery stores almost every day and past that swamp. So, I mentioned in the demon thread that I am a witch. I did my witchy thing, no more whispers to my son. Now I know this comes from a kid, so it isn't the most reliable, but with the backstory and all the odd stuff that happened when he was a baby, talking the corners, laughing at the ceiling, hearing drawers open and shut in his room late at night while he was sleeping in the crib. I think that was an old relative keeping watch, to which there was a conversation about maybe not rearranging his clothes in the middle of the night. To this day, my son still won't go down there, but has no problems on the walkway. To my knowledge, no one has actually been hurt while there. I know she is there still, and honestly, she's just lonely and sad. I won't be surprised if all goes quiet when her son finally passes. So, there is my first ghost story. Incident at the river. This happened to me last summer. I was sitting at home alone because all my friends were out of town. I was getting pretty bored, so I decided to ride my bike out to a nearby park. When I got there, I saw that no sports teams were having practices and no one was playing outside. Finding myself alone, again, I thought it would be neat to go to the river, which runs alongside the street opposite the park. People aren't supposed to go down there, but kids do it all the time, so I climbed down the steep hill and sat on a rock. I closed my eyes and tried to relax a little, when I heard what sounded like someone who was drowning, splashing around. Suddenly, I felt these cold hands grab my ankles and drag me into the river. This river runs fast, and I freaked. I swallowed a mouthful of water, and everything went black. I forced my eyes open and found myself floating in the center of a circle of bodies. Their skin was all grayish blue and decaying, and I tried to scream, but couldn't. I suddenly found myself sitting on the rock next to the river again, almost as if I dreamt the whole thing. and then I started coughing up water. I heard a disembodied voice come out in the middle of the river, telling me to leave. I wasn't about to argue with that, and I ran up the hill, across the street, and rode my bike home as fast as I could. Later, I found out that the river used to be level with the ground, and countless cars fell into the river. At least a dozen deaths were recorded there, and I don't even want to think about the relevance of my experience with the native culture here. Flashback by the Tennessee River. My family moved around a few times when I was growing up. When I was 6, we left Michigan and bought a house in Tennessee. We ended up staying in Tennessee for 16 years, and over time, I had a few paranormal experiences in that neighborhood. The first experience happened around the time we moved in. I remember seeing something weird as we were driving by one day. I was sitting in the back seat of the car, just looking out the window and checking out my new neighborhood. I saw a hill and a brick house that looked kind of old-fashioned. It wasn't a mansion, but it was definitely a strong, sturdy house, like an estate. Coming down the hill were 2 or 3 women. They had buckets and looked like they were going to get water. They were in old-fashioned clothing, but not fancy ones. They looked like maids or servants. They had bonnets on their heads and simple dresses. They looked cheerful, like they were enjoying their walk together. And I saw all this in about maybe 5 seconds as we passed by in our car. I wanted to watch them more though. Being new here and only 6, I thought they were playing dress up. And that's why they looked so old-fashioned. But when I looked for it again the second time, guess what was there? A totally different scene. The open land that I saw before had a lot more trees covering it. There wasn't as much of a hill because it had been paved over with a street of houses. I could tell it was the same place, just a lot more modernized. I didn't know what to make of it as a kid, and I just kind of forgot about the experience until recently when it came back into my memory. It was just so weird that I saw a whole picture of the old area, like time just slipped back for a second. When it came back to me later, I realized it definitely made sense that I saw flashbacks of people going to get water because we live right near the Tennessee River. It never happened again with that spot, although I have other stories of flashbacks in other parts of the neighborhood. It didn't scare me. It was just really interesting experience. Made me realize that time is kind of freaky though, like we're all in some movie that rewinds to an earlier scene.